The whole production froze when a man in a faded army jacket stepped past the camera line, stopped in the middle of the fake saloon street, and shouted John Wayne's name loud enough for the wranglers at the corral to hear it. Listen closely, because the words that stranger says in the next 30 seconds aren't praise. They're a debt Wayne didn't even know he still carried. The desert sun hung white and brutal over the Nevada set that morning, the kind of heat that made wooden storefronts creak and groan like they were settling into their bones. Dust devils spun lazily at the edge of the main street, and somewhere beyond the camera rigs, a horse nickered at the oppressive stillness. John Wayne had been standing on his mark for the third setup of the day, shoulders square under his leather coat, hat tilted just right to catch the morning light, waiting for the director to call action on a scene where his character would walk out of the sheriff's office and face down 3 outlaws in the street. Standard stuff. The kind of moment he had done 100 times across a dozen pictures. But the moment that man's voice cut through the dry air like a blade, standard disappeared and something else took its place entirely. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? The stranger was maybe 50 years old, give or take the years the sun and hard living had carved into his face like a map of places nobody should have to go. His jacket was the olive drab of army issue, faded at the elbows and patched near the left pocket with thread that didn't quite match. He walked with a slight hitch in his right leg, not quite a limp but close enough that you'd notice if you watched him long. The boots on his feet were civilian, but the way he held himself was military. Spine straight, chin level, eyes fixed on his objective like nothing else in the world existed. And he didn't stop walking until he was 10 feet from Wayne, close enough that the boom operator actually pulled his mic back like he was afraid of what might happen next. Wayne's hand didn't move toward the prop gun on his hip. That's the first thing the assistant director noticed and mentioned later to anyone who would listen. Most actors, when someone breaks onto a set like that, flinch, or step back, or at least shift their weight into a defensive posture. Wayne did none of those things. He just turned his head, slow and steady as a gun turret, and looked at the man the way you'd look at someone who owed you an explanation, but might deserve the chance to give it. "You don't know me," the stranger said. His voice was rough, the kind of rough that comes from years of cigarettes or shouting orders across a battlefield or both. "But I know you. I've known you since 1943. Nobody moved. The grip holding a bounce board near the saloon porch let it sag in his hands until the bottom edge scraped the wooden planks. The script supervisor stopped writing mid-word, her pen hovering over the page. Even the horses at the far end of the street seemed to go quiet, ears forward, as if the whole set had taken a breath and held it tight in its chest. Look at Wayne's face in this moment, because what you see there isn't anger. It isn't fear either. Though a man like that stepping uninvited onto a closed set could mean anything from an autograph seeker to something much darker. What you see is something closer to recognition, not of the man himself, but of the weight behind his words. Wayne had done war bond tours during the big one. He'd visited bases from California to Texas, to anywhere they'd let him stand on a stage and say the words he'd been asked to say. He'd shaken 10,000 hands and signed his name until his fingers cramped, and his smile felt like a mask bolted to his face. And every single time, somewhere in the back of his mind where the cameras couldn't reach, he wondered if the words he said to those boys actually meant anything once the shooting started and the dying began. The director, a lean man named Carver, with a clipboard perpetually tucked under his arm, like a security blanket, took one step forward. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone used to controlling chaos. "Sir, this is a closed set. I'm going to have to ask you to let him talk." Wayne's voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It stopped Carver cold in his tracks. 2 words, and the whole power structure of that set shifted like sand under a boot heel. The star had spoken. The director stepped back. The stranger in the army jacket nodded once. A small motion, like he'd expected nothing less than exactly this response. Names: Leonard Duff. Corporal Leonard Duff. If we're being official about it, but nobody's called me corporal in 17 years and counting. I was with the 34th Infantry Division, Italy, 43 to 45, Anzio, Monte Cassino. The whole bloody mess that they don't put in the newsreels. He paused, and in that pause, Wayne's jaw tightened, just enough to notice if you were watching close. Anzio. The name alone carried weight that most civilians couldn't begin to understand. Mud and blood, and a beachhead that cost thousands of lives to hold, while the brass figured out what went wrong. Wayne had never been there. He'd never been anywhere. The bullets were real, and the bodies didn't get up when the director yelled "cut," and standing in front of a man who had, wearing a costume and holding a prop, he felt the distance between his war and the real one open up like a canyon with no bridge across. Wait, because this is where the story turns. Not in what Duff says next, but in what Wayne chooses to do with it. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Duff said, his hand spreading slightly in a gesture that was half surrender and half appeal. "I'm not here to make a scene for the newspapers or put my name in lights. I just drove 400 miles across desert roads because I heard you were shooting out here, and I figured if I didn't say what I came to say now, I never would. A man only gets so many chances before the road runs out." The sun was climbing higher, bleaching the color out of the wooden facades, and turning the packed dirt street into something that shimmered with heat. The first AD checked his watch with the nervous tick of a man whose job depended on minutes. They were burning daylight, and daylight in the desert was money. But he didn't say a word. Nobody did. The only sound was the creak of leather and the distant stamp of horses waiting to hit their marks. Duff reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and for one sharp second, the security man standing near the catering tent tensed like a coiled spring. His hand drifted toward his hip before stopping halfway. But what Duff pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a photograph, creased and worn soft at the edges from years of handling. The kind of photograph a man keeps close because it's all he has left of something that mattered. "There were 9 of us," Duff said, his voice dropping into the register of memory. 9 boys from the same town in Ohio, who signed up together 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. We saw one of your pictures at the Rialto. Can't even remember which one now. They all run together after a while. And we walked out of that theater talking about how we were going to be like you, tough, unbreakable, the kind of men who don't back down when the odds go sideways." He held the photograph out, not offering it, just showing it the way a man shows a wound. Wayne could see the faded faces, young men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera like they had no idea what was waiting for them across the ocean. 9 faces, 9 lives, 9 futures that would never arrive. "I'm the only one left." The words landed like a stone, dropped into still water, sending ripples out in every direction. Wayne didn't move, didn't speak, but something behind his eyes shifted. A door opening onto a room he kept locked most of the time, and the people closest to him saw it happen. Notice this, because the next choice Wayne makes will define how every person on that set remembers this day for the rest of their lives. The smart move, the professional move, would have been to nod, say something respectful and appropriate, and let security escort Duff gently but firmly off the set. Shake his hand, maybe. Thank him for his service with the words everyone used, because they didn't know what else to say. Get back to work. That's what the studio would have wanted. That's what the schedule demanded. That's what everyone watching expected to happen. But Wayne didn't do the smart thing. He took off his hat. It was a small gesture, maybe meaningless to anyone who didn't understand what the hat represented. But on a man like Wayne, it meant something that couldn't be measured in words. The hat was part of the character, part of the armor he wore to keep the real world at arm's length while he lived in the pretend one. Taking it off in the middle of a setup, in front of the whole crew, was like stepping out of the role entirely and admitting he was just a man standing on dirt. "You drove 400 miles, Wayne said. His voice was quieter now. Meant just for Duff and whoever was close enough to hear the private conversation happening in a public space. You didn't come all this way just to show me a picture." Duff's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the photograph to his side. "No, sir, I didn't." The wind picked up for a moment, swirling dust across the fake street in lazy spirals, and somewhere behind them, a horse stamped its hoof against the hard-packed ground, like punctuation on a sentence that hadn't been finished yet. "Remember what I said about debts Wayne didn't know he owed? This is where you start to see the shape of it, rising up out of the dust, like something buried a long time ago." "I came to ask you one question," Duff said. "Just one, and then I'll go, and you'll never see me again. That's a promise." Carver shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The first AD looked at the sun, then at his watch, then at Wayne. They had maybe 3 hours of good light left, and they were already behind by at least 2 setups. The studio accountants would be asking questions by tomorrow morning. "Ask it," Wayne said. Duff took a breath. The kind of breath a man takes when he's been holding something inside for years and years, carrying it like a stone in his chest, and finally has the chance to set it down. "When you stood on those stages during the war, when you told all those boys to sign up and fight, when you made it sound like glory and duty and the American way," he stopped, swallowed hard against whatever was rising in his throat, and started again. "Did you ever once think about what it would be like for the ones who didn't come back? Did you ever think about the mothers who got telegrams, the wives who got folded flags, the friends who had to keep living when everyone they loved was buried in the ground an ocean away?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that wouldn't go out. "Stop for a second and look at this scene from above, because who stood where will matter more than you think." There's Wayne hatless now, his costume suddenly looking like exactly what it is, fabric and leather, nothing more than clothes on a man who bleeds the same color as everyone else. There's Duff, a soldier who carried a photograph and a question for 17 years waiting for this exact moment. And there's everyone else, frozen in the kind of silence that only happens when something real breaks through the surface of something fake and refuses to go back under. Wayne's answer would have been easy to predict if you only knew him from the screen. The Duke would have said something strong and certain, something that put the question in its place and reminded everyone who was in charge of this story. But this wasn't the screen. This was a dirt street in Nevada, with the sun beating down like judgment, and a man who had earned the right to ask whatever he wanted to ask was standing 10 feet away waiting for an answer. "Every day." Wayne's voice cracked on the second word, just barely, just enough for the people nearby to hear something they'd never heard before. "Every single day since 1945, I've thought about it. I've thought about the boys who shook my hand and smiled for the cameras and then shipped out and never came home. I've thought about whether the things I said up on those stages made any difference at all, or whether I was just—" He stopped, looked down at the hat in his hands like he'd never really seen it before, then back up at Duff. "Whether I was just playing a part while real men did real dying." Duff's expression didn't change. Whatever he'd expected Wayne to say, maybe this wasn't it. Or maybe it was exactly what he'd expected. And hearing it spoken out loud in the hot morning air was harder than he'd thought it would be. "I can't give you back your friends," Wayne said. "I can't give you back those 17 years you've spent carrying this around. But I can tell you this, I never forgot. Not once. Not for a single day. And if you think I walked away from those bond tours and those base visits feeling like a hero, you're wrong. I walked away feeling like a fraud every single time." The word hung there in the space between them. Fraud. Coming from John Wayne, on a movie set, surrounded by people who made their living building illusions out of wood and paint and camera angles, It cut deeper than anyone expected. Wait, because what happens next changes everything about how this day ends. Duff looked at Wayne for a long moment. Then he did something that caught everyone off guard. He laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh or a bitter one, or the kind of laugh that comes before violence. It was the laugh of a man who'd braced himself for a fight and found something else entirely waiting for him instead. You know what, Mr. Wayne? That's the first honest thing I've heard come out of Hollywood in my entire life. Wayne almost smiled. Almost. Yeah, well, don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation. The tension on the set didn't exactly break, but it shifted into something more bearable. People started breathing again. The first AD stopped checking his watch every 30 seconds. Even Carver uncrossed his arms and let his shoulders drop an inch or two. But the scene wasn't over. Not by a long way. Listen closely now, because the question Duff asked wasn't the only thing he came 400 miles to say. I've got one more thing, Duff said, and then I'll get out of your hair and let you get back to making your picture. He reached into his jacket again, and this time what he pulled out was something small and metallic. It caught the desert sunlight as he held it out, glinting like a piece of a star that had fallen to earth and refused to stop shining. A dog tag, tarnished by time and scratched by use, but still legible if you held it close enough. This belonged to my best friend, Charlie Whitmore. He died at Anzio holding a line that we had no business holding, so the rest of us could pull back and regroup. He was 19 years old. Just 19. Wayne looked at the dog tag but didn't reach for it. Not yet. He stood very still, the way a man stands when he knows something is coming that will change him, whether he wants it to or not. Before he shipped out, Duff continued, his voice steady but thin. Charlie saw you at a Bond rally in Cleveland, stood in line for 2 hours just to shake your hand, said you looked him right in the eye, and told him he was going to make his country proud. Duff's voice wavered but held together by force of will. He wrote me a letter about it, said it was the best moment of his entire life. A pause. 3 months later, he was dead in the Italian mud with a German bullet in his chest. The set went completely silent again. Even the wind seemed to pause and hold its breath. I'm not blaming you, Duff said quickly, as if he'd practiced saying it. I want you to understand that Charlie made his own choice. We all made our own choices. But for 17 years now, I've been carrying this around. He looked at the dog tag in his hand like it weighed more than metal should weigh, and I never knew what to do with it. And then I heard you were out here, making another picture about cowboys and gunfights and good guys winning in the end, and I thought, maybe it's time, maybe this is where it's supposed to go. He held the dog tag out toward Wayne. I want you to have it. Notice the look on Wayne's face right now. It's not the look of a man receiving a gift or an honor. It's the look of a man being handed a weight that he'll have to carry for the rest of his days. And knowing it, and reaching out to take it anyway. I can't take that, Wayne said. That belongs to you, to his memory. His memory lives in here, Duff said, tapping his chest right over his heart. I don't need the medal anymore. But maybe you do. Maybe every time you put on that costume and strap on that fake gun and walk out to face the cameras, you could look at this and remember that somewhere, sometime, the things you say actually matter, even when you think nobody's really listening. Wayne slowly reached out and took the dog tag. His fingers closed around it, and for just a moment, his hand shook like a leaf in a storm. What do you want me to do with this? Wayne asked. His voice was hoarse. Duff shrugged, a gesture that carried 17 years of weight in its casual rise and fall. That's up to you, Mr. Wayne. Keep it, bury it, throw it in a drawer somewhere. I don't care. I just needed you to have it. I needed you to know that the words you said mattered to at least one person, and that person died, a hero. The weight of those words settled over the set like a blanket made of lead and memory. Wayne stood there, the dog tag in his palm, catching the relentless Nevada sun. And for the first time in anyone's memory, he looked small. Not physically. The man was still 6'4" and built like he could stop a charging bull. But something inside had shifted, contracted, made room for something it hadn't carried before. Carver finally stepped forward, his voice gentle as he could make it. "Mr. Wayne, we do need to." "I know." Wayne cut him off, but without any heat. "Give me 5 minutes. Then Wayne looked at Duff with eyes that had seen something new. "You got somewhere else you need to be?" Duff blinked. "What?" "I asked if you got somewhere to be. Because if you don't, I'd like you to stay. Watch us work for a while. Have lunch with the crew." Wayne paused. "Let me show you what I do when I'm not standing on stages making speeches." The offer caught everyone off guard. Duff most of all. "Yeah," Duff said after a moment. "Yeah, I could do that." Wayne walked over to the director's chair with his name on the back and held it out for Duff. "Sit here. Best view on the whole set. That's your chair. I'll be standing in the sun all day anyway. Sit. Wait. Because this moment is the hinge the whole day turns on." Duff sat in John Wayne's chair, and he watched as the biggest Western star in the world put his hat back on and walked back to his mark. The cameras rolled. Wayne stepped out of the sheriff's office to face down 3 outlaws. But the scene didn't play the same. The way Wayne walked was heavier, like a man carrying something invisible. His lines had an edge they hadn't had before. 3 takes. Carver stared at the monitor. "What the hell was that?" he murmured. It wasn't a complaint. It was awe. "Listen, because the story isn't over yet." They broke for lunch at noon, the catering tent filling with the smell of grilled meat and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Instead of retreating to his trailer, the way he always did, the way everyone expected a star of his magnitude to behave, Wayne walked straight to one of the long communal tables where the grips and gaffers and wranglers took their meals. He sat down on the bench like it was the most natural thing in the world, and when he patted the empty space beside him and looked at Duff, the invitation didn't need words. Duff sat next to him. The crew members already at the table exchanged glances, some confused, some curious, but all of them smart enough to keep their mouths shut and see where this was going. Duff told stories. He talked about Ohio in the early 40s, about the little town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the biggest excitement was the Friday night picture show at the Rialto Theater. He talked about the 9 boys who'd signed up together: Tommy, Ray, Eddie, Sam, Vincent, George, Bill, Charlie, and himself. How they'd walked into the recruiting station as a group and walked out as soldiers to be. He talked about the ship that took them across the Atlantic, the endless gray water and the constant fear of submarines, and the way they'd promised each other that no matter what happened, they'd stick together. He talked about Charlie Whitmore, really talked about him, the way he laughed at jokes that weren't even funny, the way he gave away his cigarettes even when he was down to his last pack, the way he wrote letters to a girl named Margaret back home, who never once wrote back, but somehow that didn't stop him. Wayne listened, not the polite, distracted listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the deep and genuine listening of someone who understood that stories were how the living kept the dead alive. Halfway through the hour, one of the older grips, a weathered man named Martinez, who'd served in the Pacific and carried his own collection of ghosts, pulled up a chair without being invited and started talking too. Then another crew member joined in. Then another. By the time the lunch hour was winding down, there were 6 veterans at that table, their voices low and their eyes distant, swapping stories that most of them had never told to anyone outside the brotherhood of men who'd been there. Notice what's happening here. A movie set, built from the ground up to manufacture illusions and sell dreams, had somehow become the most real and honest place any of them had been in a very long time. But the clock was still ticking. Carver approached Wayne. "We're behind schedule. We'll make it up. But today we do it different. Wayne turned to Duff. You ever ridden a horse? Not since I was a kid. Good. You're going to be in the next scene. Background. Just riding past. Charlie loved movies, didn't he? Let's put him on screen. Remember what I said about debts? This is how you pay one you didn't know you owed. Wardrobe dressed Duff in period clothes. The cameras rolled. Wayne argued with the preacher about justice and mercy. In the background, Duff rode past. Slow, steady, the camera catching him clearly. Carver called cut. That's the one. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, Wayne gathered the crew. I'm not one for speeches. But today something happened that I need to say out loud. He pulled out the dog tag. This belonged to Charlie Whitmore. He died at Anzio in 1944. His last memory of home was shaking my hand. He paused. I'm going to carry this for the rest of my life. And every time I play at being brave, I'll remember that real bravery doesn't come with a script. I talked to the studio. There's going to be a dedication in the credits, in memory of the men of the 34th Infantry Division, especially Charles Robert Whitmore, who gave everything. Wayne looked at Duff. One more scene, you and me, walking down this street together. No dialogue. Two men who've seen things nobody should have to see. The sun was setting behind the false fronts. Wayne and Duff walked into frame. Wait, because this is the image everyone remembered. Two men silhouetted against a dying sun, walking side by side down a street that didn't exist in any real town, not as hero and supplicant. Just two men carrying the same weight. Carver let the camera roll until the light was gone. The next morning, Duff drove back to Ohio. Before he left, Wayne shook his hand. You ever want to come back? You call me. I might take you up on that. Years later, audiences noticed something truly different about Wayne's work there. A heaviness. Critics called it his best work. If you want to hear what happened the next time Duff came back to that set, because yes, he came back, tell me in the comments. Some stories need a sequel. And if Charlie could see what happened on that dusty Nevada street, I think he would have smiled. Not because his name was in those credits, but because his best friend finally let go.